Hello everybody and welcome to our Lightroom and Photoshop tutorial for the two-step processing. We're going to start here with a photo shoot that I shot a few months ago. I've edited this down to the images that I want to show you. These are basically ambient strobe, ambient strobe, ambient strobe. As you can see here, ambient strobe, ambient strobe, ambient strobe, ambient strobe. Alright, so everything is flagged, and we're now going to move into the development page. So click on the development, and over here are my real estate processing profiles. So the first thing I'm going to do for this process is go through and select all of my ambient exposures. I'm going to show you the way that I process things and how I process things quickly, as opposed to a longer process or an individual process. We're going to do these all on selection and syncing of profiles. So I'm going to go through here and select all of my ambient exposures. I'm going to go back over here to my profiles, and I'm going to select my Tokina Ambient HDR profile. Name that according to your lens, that way it doesn't get confused with other ones, or with ones that you use for other people. The only thing that this isn't going to do is set the brightness. So I'm going to set the brightness manually, and then I'm going to go down here and hit sync. All of my ambient exposures are already pre-selected. So we're looking here at the synchronized settings panel. The only ones that aren't are white balance, exposure, tone splitting because we don't use it, local adjustments because we rarely use those, transform because we don't use the transform settings in Photoshop individually on images, in Lightroom on individual images, because we're going to merge these together later on in Photoshop. And if our transform settings get detected differently between the ambient and the strobe exposure, which sometimes happens, those images are going to have a very, very hard time lining up in Photoshop later on. So I usually leave the transform settings off for this stage. The only time that I really use those is for the exterior images of the home. It doesn't really work for the two-step process, just letting you know. In the crop setting, if something needs to be cropped, I generally do that in Photoshop later on. So I will show you this. We're going to synchronize all these settings. All of the settings are synchronized. The only thing it's not going to do, like I said before, is adjust brightness. So I'm going to go through and manually adjust brightness on the ones that I feel like it needs them. And the only other thing I might do is adjust the color a little bit. So that's either going to be setting the white balance manually myself, or it might also be utilizing the HSL color panel. Now, default setting in Lightroom is to have this panel look like this, which is overwhelming and ridiculous. So the only thing you really need to realize is that these affect individual colors and tones in your image. You can adjust them individually per color, per channel, for luminance, saturation, and hue. The only thing we really need to concentrate on is one individual color, either yellow or orange. And if you just click on the color tab itself as opposed to the HSL, you will get the individual color by themselves. So I generally just leave this on yellow because that's usually the only one that I'm adjusting, depending on how gross some of the tungsten lights are. So I'm going to tone down the yellow in this image a little bit, probably take about 24 points out. That's usually the case with some of these, just because you don't know if it's an LED light or if it is actually old school tungsten. So like this here, these just render themselves pretty yellow. So I'll dial that down a bit. Open my brightness up a bit. Because we do want them to appear to be ambient light, but we don't want it to be overwhelmingly grossly yellow. And we don't want there to be that much of a difference in between the ambient exposure and our strobe exposure. So we're going to adjust those manually. Now, the way I've got the screen configured right now is not the way I normally utilize Lightroom. I have two monitors. My second monitor is a widescreen. I usually put my grid over on my second monitor so that I can view all of these images together at once so that I know what my brightness looks like across the entire photo shoot. So that might be something to take into consideration. I highly recommend using two monitors to do this work. If you don't already, I highly recommend it. It makes this workflow and it makes this work much, much, much easier if you use Lightroom with 2 screens. So now all of my ambient exposures are selected and all of them are corrected. So I'm going to go up here to the Edit tab. I'm going to go Invert Selection. Now all of my strobe exposures are selected. Now bear in mind, I have no exterior images in this photo shoot right here that I'm showing you. If you have exterior images in addition to your ambient and strobe exposures, you will need to deselect those before this next step. Otherwise, you will apply the strobe HDR profile to all of your exterior images in addition to your interior images. So just be aware. I'm showing you this without exterior images because that's pretty straightforward and I think everyone can process those themselves. So we're going to select our first image in the strobe area. I'm going to adjust the brightness just a little bit, and I'm going to go over here to my Tokina Strobe HDR, select that, and that will apply the lens profile, apply all of my other settings that I utilize for that. Then I'm going to go over here and do exactly the same thing that I did for the ambient exposures. I'm going to do the same settings on my synchronized settings, no transform, no crop, none of that. Spot removable, that really only happens if you have dust on your sensor, in which case, clean your sensor. Don't do it that way with the spot removal. So as you can see, it's applying the profile as it goes through. Some of these I will adjust the brightness manually myself. So I am going to show you a couple of tricks right now. If you are familiar with Lightroom and the way it works, you can just skip ahead to the next part, but I do want to show some people some little tricks that Lightroom will allow you to do that will really improve the nature of your images. So I shot this one and added this one to this tour specifically for this. As you can see, it's really bright on one side and really, really kind of dark on the other side because of the way the strobe was aimed. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually use the graduated filter tool. Use hotkey M, or you can select it over there. So you can apply this across, and it will selectively apply density to your image if you utilize the exposure tab. So I'm going to slide that over, hit done, go back up, make another one over here, and make that one a reversal of the other one. So with 2 quick, simple moves, I've normalized the exposure across the entire frame. So I just wanted to give you a quick example of that. So all of these are selected. Density and brightness looks fine for me for these. Maybe the bathroom needs a little bit of adjustment. So now we are going to go back up to our edit panel and hit select all, go to export. Now, I'm showing you this all in tabs because there's no reason for me to use keystrokes for this. That would just be mean. So we're going to name this whatever we're going to name it. In this case, it's just going to be test photo shoot. So as you can see over here, I have some of these ready to go. My real estate export is set to load my files into a specific area in my Dropbox folder. It is set to have them at 3,000 pixels wide at 300 dpi. JPEG, sRGB, because it's going onto the web. Otherwise, it'll look weird. So we're just going to leave them just like that, hit our Export tab, and then we're going to walk away because, at least on every system I've ever worked on, Export's kind of a jerk. So I'm going to go get a beverage, and I'll meet you in Photoshop in just a couple of minutes.